Welcome to Mission 150, the podcast that tells stories from 150 years of Seventh-day Adventist mission to the world. To find out more about the mission of the Adventist Church today, go to adventistmission.org. That's adventistmission.org.
We're so glad that you've been able to join us again. I'm David Trim.
And I am Sam Nevis. Today we're going to start the episode slightly differently. We want to mention two people and their teams that help to pull this podcast every single week. It's not easy.
It's not easy.
What you don't know is that behind it, there's a whole crew led by Dennis on this end. And when they do their work, they upload it to a cloud somewhere, which basically is just someone else's computer. And then the brilliant Daryl Gungadu brings down that footage, and his team builds what you are watching or listening to right now. So this whole team is very thrilled to bring you these episodes because it might have an impact in how you see the mission of the Adventist Church. You may not be even an Adventist, and you're just interested in finding out how a group of Americans in the 1800s led this movement that is now in every corner of the world. Well, regardless of the reasons why you're here, we're very thankful to the whole team for putting this together.
Yes, so thanks to Dennis Panice and to Daryl Gungadu, who make us look and sound better than we actually are.
Indeed, every week. David, today we are going to talk about two families, right? And when you mention families, I already get scared. Do they die?
The two missionary families we're looking at today do not die. They survive.
At least in the mission field.
Well, yeah, they die. They're all dead, but they didn't die in the period we're looking at.
They survived the mission experience.
They did.
And if I understood correctly, we're going to enter in South America.
That's right. Both of them served on the South American continent. One served in Guyana, on the northeast coast of the continent, and in the Seventh-day Adventist Church's Inter-American Division, and the other family served in 3 countries on the west coast of the continent in the church's South American Division.
All right, let's go.
So we're going to start with Alfred and Elizabeth Cot. They were recruited to be missionaries by William Baxter Sr., whose career as a missionary we looked at in episode 22. And if you're interested, you can go back and watch or listen to episode 22 to find out more about William Baxter.
He stayed there for a long time, isn't
He was there for many, many years.
I remember that.
He was the one who was basically sent home because otherwise he was going to die, and who appealed...
No, I want to stay.
Yeah, and who appealed a General Conference Committee decision to allow him to stay, which they did, and he then stayed many more years. So Baxter was extraordinary, and well worth listening to again. But at any rate, Alfred and Elizabeth Cot. The Cotts worked for 9 years among 2 tribes of Indians, the Acawayo and the Aracuna, located in the Mount Roraima region at the intersection of Guyana, Venezuela, and Brazil. Among Adventists, these Indians were often known as the Davis Indians, named after Ovid Davis, the first missionary to reach the region, who died serving among them in 1911. They were then cut off from Westerners until William Baxter found them and located Davis's grave in 1925. So having reconnected with them, there was a need for new missionaries to work among these tribes who literally, Sam, lived off the map, because cartographers had not yet been able to map the Mount Roraima region. So they're literally off the map.
In our previous episode, we talked about our leaders wanting to focus on the unreached completely.
Yes.
And the middle of the jungle classifies as unreached in this case, in every sense of the word.
Absolutely. These people have had barely any contact with Westerners, so they certainly haven't heard about Jesus. Now, Alfred Cot had been born in Britain in 1887, and he had studied at the prestigious Cambridge University. But when he was converted in 1921, he gave up his studies and went to the United States. He later qualified as a nurse at Glendale Sanitarium in California. Elizabeth had been born in Canada in 1894, I should say, but she too had graduated from the nurse's course at Glendale Sanitarium. Their journey from San Francisco took them through the Panama Canal, and then 8 days on the ship to Trinidad, then across to Georgetown, British Guyana, as it was then called. And then they had to travel 400 miles to a place so remote and unentered that the last 150 miles had to be made on foot with Indian guides. And the last part of the journey by foot through the mountains and the jungle took them 5.5 weeks.
This is stuff from hundreds of years ago, except it wasn't.
It's right. It's in the 20th century.
They're going to the middle of nowhere. How did they know where to go?
Well, Baxter had followed, the explorers and so forth had gone through some of these regions. And of course, Ovid Davis had somehow reached these people back before the First World War. William Baxter gets contact with them again in 1925. So, but yes, how to get there is in itself an interesting question. And then the actual getting there, as I say, it takes them 5.5 weeks to travel 150 miles.
David, this is imagine the sense of adventure, right?
Yeah.
That you're there to fulfill the mission God gave you, but you're going through the jungle and
the mountains. Yes.
and climbing and this is the stuff of legends.
This absolutely, this is pioneering mission, and Ovid Davis has actually become, the man who died there actually has become something of a legend, because there's a great story of how he told the Indians that one day another missionary would come.
He just knew.
He was an Adventist. He knew and said, be ready for when they come. So the Indians had basically been waiting all this time. So it's a story that's often been told. But that's his story. The story we haven't told is the story of Alfred and Elizabeth Cot, which is why we're telling it today, because they're the people who actually follow up and bring these two tribes of Indians, the Akawayo and the Aracuna, more firmly into the Seventh-day Adventist orbit. Now, the Cotts obviously are incredibly isolated, and they faced huge challenges, and they had an overwhelming workload. Even a short journey required considerable physical effort, either slogging through the jungle on foot or paddling a canoe on often dangerous mountain streams and rivers. And even ministry at the mission station that they set up, that they had to literally cut out of the jungle, even ministry at the mission station was all-consuming. Elizabeth wrote a letter home in 1933 of how they had recently cut down a purple heart tree, hollowed it out, tarred it, and painted it green and gray, and so now they had a new canoe.
Wow. They were making canoes.
They were making their own canoes. Alfred was off traveling in the canoe, leaving all of the mission work to her.
It's the ultimate advanced guide to Pathfinders, right? This is your master guide, complete.
This is when you wish you'd paid attention in Pathfinder course, which didn't yet exist, of course.
Wow.
But, so Elizabeth writes, Alfred is off traveling, so all the mission work is down to her at the mission station. She wrote of teaching vegetarian cookery and of how young girls and young wives are already making new dishes, but the older ones don't like the new food. But then she says, they will soon, though, I think.
There's hope.
She's trying to convert them to vegetarianism. But she also wrote, and she did it without complaining, just matter-of-factly, she wrote, I sure have been busy from 5:45 a.m. until 10 p.m.
Wow.
And after holding meetings with the Indians, teaching school, and looking after the sick, and various other duties. And that was their daily regimen for 9 years. Now, it's one that many missionaries of the early 1900s would have recognized, but in some respects, the Cotts' burden was greater than that faced by most missionaries. How do we know this? Because after their enforced return due to chronic ill health, H.T. Eliot, who was Associate Secretary of the General Conference, told a colleague, quote, these good people have carried on with their work under conditions that few, if any of our workers in the world have to face, farther isolated by travel, perhaps, than almost any of our missionaries in the world. And then he said how, despite enormous difficulties just in visiting the people for whom they were working, they had nevertheless, he said, faithfully undertaken their evangelistic and medical work until Sister Cott's health broke, and it became apparent that they could not remain amidst these difficulties in the tropical climate longer. He said they had risked everything they have, and even their lives.
Amazing.
So we know that they faced an incredible burden, as he says, perhaps farther removed and farther isolated by travel than almost any of our missionaries in the world. Now, Alfred, Elizabeth, and Joyce, their daughter, all started to suffer malaria soon after their arrival, and continued to do so throughout their 9 years in Guyana. Alfred's malaria became chronic.
Hmm.
Furthermore, in the cases of the parents at least, malaria remained in their systems long term. But these were not their only afflictions. When the Cotts returned from the mission field in late February 1935, medical tests showed that they all three of them had hookworm. They also had amoeba.
Wow.
As a result, Elizabeth was suffering badly from amoebic dysentery as well as malaria and other illnesses, some that were probably due to intense nervous strain on top of actual bacterial or viral infection.
But these presumably could be treated.
They were treated,
they
and they
were
were
back.
treated. Once they got back, they were treated at Adventist hospitals.
Mhm.
By the summer of 1935, remember they get home in late February. By the summer, Alfred was free of hookworm and amoebic infection, but even after much treatment, Elizabeth and their daughter Joyce were not yet free. They still had it some months later. Elizabeth had in fact suffered, in the judgment of one doctor, a complete breakdown of health. She required 3 major operations in hospital when in the United States, and also suffered from chronic diseases. For many months after they left Guyana, Elizabeth continued to suffer poor health. In September 1936, so that's 19 months after returning home, she was still, her husband wrote to church leaders, not free of amoeba and malaria. And physicians in California were perplexed as to the continuing incidence of malaria attacks and of chronic, terrible headaches.
She couldn't shake it off. It's almost 2 years.
Exactly. It's still with her. Now, even 10 years earlier, Sam, certainly 20, I don't think there's any doubt the Cotts would have died.
I see.
Like so many of the...
It's what you always mentioned, right? At the end of the 20th century and the early...
at the
19th century and the early 20th century, there weren't enough medical facilities at hand, and there wasn't enough understanding of those diseases,
Right.
more to the point, that we lost many missionaries. And now we lost less, not because it was, to some degree, it was less dangerous, because there was a better understanding of those illnesses and more access. They would have died if it was 30 years before then.
Even maybe 10 years before then. They would have died. But by the 1930s, they could at least be treated effectively once they returned from their remote outpost. But that didn't mean they didn't suffer and continue to suffer even once they had returned home. And I think this was a story familiar to many other missionaries of the period. But, like other missionaries, their intense labor and sufferings were not without fruit. During the years that the Cotts served the Akawayo and Aracuna tribes, they established 2 local churches with 116 members in Guyana, and they had won other converts on the Venezuela side of the border, which for the local people didn't exist. There was no border. But they'd won other people in the Venezuelan side as well. So their efforts have some good results.
That's beautiful. Okay, David, what's the other family we're going to talk about today?
So further south, the Amazon jungles and the mountainous region of the Andes pose different but difficult challenges, and among those who took them on were Dick and Joe Hayden.
Okay.
Richard Augustus Hayden was born May 31st, 1903 in Los Angeles, California, but he grew up in Eugene, Oregon, where the possibility of a career as a professional footballer opened up for the strapping young man who was well over 6 feet tall.
Now, is this American football?
Yes,
soccer?
American football.
Okay.
So as a result, he attended the University of Oregon for a year, where he did play football for the University of Oregon.
Okay.
But then he was influenced by his older sister Lottie, who had died of cancer aged only 33 when Richard was 21, and he transferred to Walla Walla College, the Adventist college in the Pacific Northwest.
Right.
And there, in his last year, the college president, W.I. Smith, ended the week of prayer with a call for students to embrace missionary service. And Dick Hayden told a friend, "I have been led here for a definite purpose." Some years earlier, he had heard Floyd Bressie, an Adventist missionary to Peru, speak at a Missionary Volunteer Society meeting, and had been inspired. And Dick decided, having heard the appeal for missionaries, decided, if God is willing, I will go to South America when I finish my college training.
People have been saying I will go for a very long time.
Yeah, that's right. He says it. He says, I will go. It's literally what he says. He graduated in 1927 with a BA in education and taught in a church school in the Columbia Valley.
So not theology then.
Not theology. But he felt the calling to ministry, and he began evangelistic work in 1929 in Washington State, but he also still felt the calling to South America. He got married, and his new wife, Georgiana, who was known to friends and family as Jo, the two of them accepted a call to serve in the Inca Union of the South American Division. They sailed for Peru in September 1930. Richard was 27. Georgiana, or Jo, was just 21 years old.
Wow.
So it's not just in the very early 20th century that we're sending very young people. This continues through to the 1930s. At some point, it becomes more common to say, no, we need to send experienced, well-established people as missionaries. But at least up to World War II, it was no, you send whoever's willing to volunteer. And because I think I've never seen this written down anywhere, Sam, but I'm sure part of the calculation must be these people are going to face terrible disease challenges. So you actually want somebody who is younger and who is in robust health. So who better than a strapping 6-foot-tall young man who used to play American football?
Right,
He's going to be physically
right.
fit at any rate. For their first 3 years, Richard served as a local pastor in the Amazon mission, working under the inspirational leadership of the legendary missionaries Ferdinand and Anna Stahl.
I heard about them.
And exactly, they're legendary in South America where you grew up. And we need to do an episode, maybe 2, on Ferdinand and Anna Stahl. So we'll listeners and viewers will do that in the future. We will come back to them. Yeah. So he was working under the Stahls. Richard and Jo were based in the remote village of Iquitos, deep in the jungles of Peru's Amazonian region. People who don't know, people may think of Peru mostly about the Andes Mountains, but on the east side of the Andes Mountains are the intense jungles, because the river Amazon has its ultimate sources in those mountains of Peru. So actually the Amazonian jungle isn't just Brazil, it extends all the way across. And so on the east side of the Andes Mountains are the Amazon jungles of Peru. It's both got the Andes and the lowland river jungles.
And it's very wild.
And it was very wild
I think
at this point.
that's where the legend of Paddington Bear comes from.
That's incidentally came from darkest Peru.
There you go.
For those who remember reading that to their children or reading it as a child.
But this isn't legend.
This is truth. And so
Richard and Jo were there.
They were in Iquitos, which is, really deep in the jungle. Their first child, Richard Jr., was born there in 1932. Richard Dean Hayden, he's called. In 1933, the Haydens moved 800 miles south to the Andes Mountains to serve in the Lake Titicaca training school in Juliaca, where Richard served as principal. But after 16 months, he was appointed secretary, or director, we would say now, of the missionary, volunteer, and education departments of the Lake Titicaca mission, with headquarters in Peru's second city, Arequipa. Richard and Jo's second son, John, was born there in 1935, in Arequipa. A third child, a girl, Carolyn, was born in Spokane, Washington State, while they were on furlough in 1936, but all 3 children were raised in South America. Now, the high Andes, in some ways, had a better climate than the Amazon jungles.
Dry, but without air. Without much oxygen.
Right. And the problem is you can suffer from altitude sickness.
Yeah.
And actually, Ferdinand Stahl suffered from altitude sickness. And eventually, he and his wife had started working in the Andes, and they had to transfer down to the Amazon region because he suffered so badly from altitude sickness. But this doesn't seem to have been a problem for the Haydens. But it is less deadly in terms of disease. You don't have the tropical diseases that are there in the jungles. And the early symptoms of altitude sickness can be highly unpleasant, and if it's not treated, it can be fatal. And there are a range of other diseases still endemic in the mountains. So it's not as bad as the jungles, but it's still dangerous. Now, medical science by the 1930s had advanced considerably, even over where it had been before World War I. But there were limited opportunities for really up-to-date medical care in the Andes, as in the upper Amazon, because it's so remote. You've still got some distance to travel before you can get to a modern hospital.
Right.
I mean, it's not as bad as the Cotts, who had, weeks of journey, but it's still dangerous. The other thing is the Andes region was characterized by poverty and deliberate neglect on the part of the authorities and landowners. The landowners were eager to maintain their wealth at the expense of the indigenous population. Interestingly, Sam, this social and economic oppression was something Adventist missionaries like the Stalls and the Haydens fought against. They encouraged the Andean and Amazonian native tribes to resist these oppressors, though peacefully, because for them, this kind of oppression is directly at odds with Adventism's message of health, wholeness, and hope. This is inconsistent. We can't have this. And also, actually, simply by teaching them to read and write. That today, of course, we just accept that as being a very straightforward Adventist thing to do, because how else can you study the Bible and the writings of Ellen White? So wherever Adventists go, we start schools and we teach people how to read and write.
But if you educate a slave, you free a slave.
Exactly. And
yeah.
And many of these people are trapped in contracts which they don't understand, which they've been tricked into signing, which set various terms for them, which they can't do anything about because they can't read. So actually for the landowners, just by teaching people to read, Adventists are incendiaries. Adventists are radicals. And Stahl and other Adventist missionaries get accused of being communists.
Interesting.
Which is absurd, you know. Adventists, if somebody less likely to be a communist than an Adventist missionary, it's hard to find. But that's what they mean is these people are radicals. So as a result, Stahl actually was in danger of his life several times when he was in the Andes. That was the 1910s. By the 1930s, things have eased somewhat, but it was still dangerous to serve as missionaries in the Andes. And if adults were less likely to die than 20 or 25 years before, their children were all too often at risk, not just of illness, but of death. There is a photograph that we will put in the video version that shows an Adventist graveyard high in the mountains where a cluster of deceased missionary kids were buried.
Oh, wow.
So this, you might think, would be a powerful deterrent factor for a family like Dick and Joe Hayden, who have 3 young children.
Right.
And yet they never seem to have taken into account, they trusted in God that He would work in their lives as He saw fit. So in 1937, they left Peru, but they didn't leave the Andes because Dick had been called to the Bolivian mission as Education and Missionary Volunteer Secretary. After 3 years' service in Bolivia, he was elected in 1940 as director, president, we would say today, of the Amazon mission, and he served there for 8 years. So back in the Amazon river jungles.
8 years is almost a decade. That's a lot.
Yeah. In 1948-49, he briefly worked in education again as a Bible professor at Inca Union College in Peru's capital and largest city, Lima. Today's Peru Adventist University, which is a flourishing university.
Oh, it's wonderful. I've been there.
I hope to visit at some point.
Yeah.
But then in 1949, Dick was called to the Inca Union Mission headquarters, also in Lima, as Home Missionary and Sabbath School Secretary. And he served in that capacity for 10 years until 1959, when he and Joe moved to Ecuador, their 3rd South American country, because Richard had been elected president of the Ecuador mission. After not quite 2 years, they went back to Peru, where Richard became the first president of the new North Peru mission, and he served in that capacity for 4 years, 1961 through 63, before he stepped down to the role of departmental director to allow an indigenous leader to serve as president.
Nice.
Yeah. And for the Haydens' last 4.5 years in Peru, Dick stayed in the North Peru mission, serving as departmental secretary, as it was then called, of the lay activities, Sabbath school, and radio and television departments. Today we would say director of the Sabbath school and personal ministries and the communications departments.
Interesting set of portfolio here they gave him.
Yeah.
They put him as president quite regularly.
Yes, and in different countries.
Yeah.
So he was clearly an exceptional leader.
Must have spoken Spanish quite well.
Must have spoken Spanish fluently, especially considering how long he'd been there.
Yeah.
Because remember, they arrived in 1930 and they left Peru in July 1968. And of course, in theory, they were going home, but I wonder if Dick and Joe Hayden still thought of America as home, because they'd been in South America for 38 years.
That's a long time.
Meanwhile, in August 1967, their eldest son, Richard Jr., who was 35 and who had thus far spent his career teaching in Adventist academies on the West Coast, he accepted a call to mission service in the Inter-American Division. He served in Puerto Rico for 10 months, but he thought, this is too much like America. This isn't enough of a mission challenge for me.
Interesting.
Remember, this is a boy who's grown up in the Amazon jungles and the remote Andes Mountains. He said, this is too much like America.
It's like Caleb. Give me the giant.
Give me the giant. Absolutely. Absolutely. And he was able to arrange a transfer to the Nicaragua mission, where he served for 2.5 years. But sadly, in November 1970, while on his first furlough, he died in a plane crash. Richard Dean was aged just 38. Richard Augustus, Dick Sr., died on September 24, 1990, aged 87. Georgiana, or Joe, died on Christmas Eve, 1996, also aged 87.
They lost a missionary son.
They lost it, absolutely. Not to disease, just to a plane crash, and while on furlough, which could happen to him, but still, yes. So 2 generations. Now, Dick and Joe had served as missionaries to Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador for 37 years and 9 months. Except for 11 years at the Inca Union and its college, they had always worked at the local level. They spent 26 years, Sam, in frontline mission. Now, Dick Hayden was never a union officer. He never held a position at the division headquarters. In the eyes of some, his career would be regarded as mediocre and undistinguished. You know, he spent all these years here and he never rises to the level of something important. But in Christ's eyes, I think he sees the Haydens as heroic. He doesn't think of their career as mediocre. He thinks of it as wonderful and self-sacrificing. And I love a letter that Richard wrote to the General Conference on April 30, 1968, confirming their retirement. He wrote, Mrs. Hayden and I have been laboring here in the Inca Union since 1930, and it is hard for us to leave our many friends here, but we are glad to see these younger Peruvian men take over. And his career is not marked by pride, not by a craving for promotion, not for wanting to rise in the hierarchy, only passion to push the work forward and to reach the day when local leaders are able to take over, so that Richard is able deliberately to stand aside in the North Peru mission and say, no, let a local man take over and then I'll support him as a departmental director.
Nice.
And the indigenous people do take over and they push the church farther and farther, but it was the missionary sacrifice and commitment in the early days that laid the foundation for the 21st century church in Latin America. People like the Cotts, people like the Haydens. And let me just underscore the achievement of the missionary years. In 1930, when Dick and Joe Hayden arrived in Peru, there were 7,450 church members in the Inca Union mission, comprising Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia.
That's not much.
Indeed. In 1968, when they left, the Inca Union's membership was 54,548.
Wow.
Growth by a factor of 7.
That's amazing. Today,
those 3 nations are now organized in 4 different unions, and they have a total audited membership of 598,325, growth since 1930 by a factor of 80.
That is unbelievable.
Now, of course, the exponential growth comes when the Peruvians, Bolivians, and Ecuadorians take on the mission for themselves.
But you need to have natives that are ready to lead.
Absolutely. And it's missionaries like Dick and Joe Hayden who had laid the foundations in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. They not only do the work and baptize and help bring up new converts, but they also train the next generation of leaders, the people who will take this on and really make it go. But without the missionaries and their willingness to sacrifice. Now, the Haydens never seem to have suffered from particularly bad diseases, but of course they're sacrificing because they're far from their families.
They gave their lives to the mission field too.
They gave their lives to the mission field, and so as he says, it's going to be very hard for us to leave because we have so many friends here.
Yeah.
But so without the sacrifice of people like the Cotts who give up their health, and the Haydens who give their lives, where would the church be in Inter-America and South America today? Today, those are two of the
That's a great
powerhouses of the world church,
Yeah.
but we should honor the commitment of the people who went there and laid the foundations.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks again for joining us in this episode of Mission 150. We hope that you will keep watching on AdventistReview.tv, on the Seventh-day Adventist Church's YouTube channel, or listening on your favorite podcast platform. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends. Like it on YouTube, hit subscribe. If you want to know more about Adventist missionary work and missionaries today, go to adventistmission.org. And if you want to find opportunities for mission service today, go to vividfaith.com. We'll be back next time with more on the inspiring history of Adventist mission around the world.